Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going, Joe?
All right. How are you doing?
Doing okay. Wondering just how robust our democracy is, but so far things seem to be progressing towards a handoff of power, which is going to be messy, but complete nonetheless.
Yeah, that's certainly the good news. The bad news here in New York is that they just closed public schools again yesterday, which is extremely frustrating for me. Not only because I have a 15-year-old daughter who's adversely affected, but because the infection rate inside New York City public schools right now is 0.23%, which means that unless you're living in a crypt somewhere, the New York City public schools are literally the best place you can possibly be in this pandemic. So to close the schools and keep bars and restaurants and gyms open is beyond me.
Yeah, that seems questionable. Bars, at least. I think we can all agree that it's just as easy and good to get drunk at home as it is to get drunk on the road. It's cheaper, guys. So get your buzz on in the safety of your own home. We don't need to be drunk in the presence of others. So let's get into this. So I did feel pretty guilty over the last couple of weeks, Joe, because you sent me the very nice gift of giving me the opportunity in the previous episode to think about something other than politics for a while. And then I sent you right back into the cesspool with my question of whether or not the Hispanic vote in the United States is actually a thing that exists and what or who that voting bloc is likely to benefit 4 years from now. So what did you discover?
Well, it's a cesspool that certainly demanded some inspection, so I guess in retrospect, I'm happy to have done it. I like to start with the short answer before I dig deep. And the short answer to your first question, is there such a thing as the Hispanic vote, is that it's many different things, not just one thing. It's not a monolith. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy that works in courting it. Mm-hmm. These voters are diverse. Their political preferences vary depending on a number of factors, some of which I'll talk about in this podcast. So that's the eagle-eye view. Before I get deep into the weeds, though, I want to talk a bit about how we refer to this community of voters, because there are a few terms commonly used, and I didn't really understand the difference between them before researching this question. The words Hispanic and Latino are both ethnonyms, which simply means names applied to ethnic groups. And by the way, that's different from an ethnosexual, which is a person who likes to have sex with people of different ethnicities.
Thank you for pointing that out. I would hate to use it incorrectly in a social setting.
Well, I thought I might ask you to mansplain that for me someday.
Yeah. Eventually, we're going to have to take up the banner of ethnosexuality, but not today.
But anyway, the words Hispanic and Latino are both of recent vintage, and they're both used to describe the subpopulations or particular subpopulations of United States residents. Hispanic was first used by the U.S. government in the early 1970s and was defined by the feds in 1977 as, quote, a person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South America or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race.
So basically anyone who spoke Spanish at home.
Yes. And then Latino emerged in the 1990s to describe people with ancestry in Latin American countries, regardless of the language they speak. So Brazilians are arguably Latino because they hail from South America, but they're not Hispanic because they speak Portuguese.
Right.
Then by the year 2000, both of those terms were included in the U.S. Census under a joint definition. Latino became popular because it was seen as more inclusive and because the word Hispanic suggests colonialism or a subservient relationship to Spain. However, Latino is technically reserved for males and Latina for females. So to refer to everyone as Latino is like referring to humanity as mankind.
Right. Yeah.
Which really pisses off my wife, by the way.
I have no doubt of it. I have heard fairly recently, in fact, I think this year was the first, Latinx presented as the non-gender specific version of the two.
Yes, exactly. It's part of the recent culture-wide efforts to challenge the gender binary. Latinx was introduced in the early 2000s. But here's the thing about that term. Recent surveys show that only 2% of U.S. residents of Latin American descent actually use the term, and only 23% have even heard of it. So it's a term that white people use to refer to other people. Yeah, and specifically people in the academy, intellectuals and academics. So it hasn't really taken hold yet. And there's a lot of blowback against it in the Hispanic community. So all this is to say that because Hispanic is still the preferred term of most Spanish-speaking Americans, and because it's the term you used in your question, I'm going to use it from this point forward, with the proviso that if we receive any death threats, I'm going to refer those to you, Mark.
It's a fair cop. Yeah. Okay. I accept that responsibility.
Okay, great. All right. One last point about semantics, and that is I'm half Irish American, half Italian American. My Irish side refers to itself as Irish, and my Italian side refers to itself as Italian. Similarly, if you ask most Cuban Americans, they describe themselves as Cuban. Most Mexican Americans say they're Mexican, or possibly Tejano if they live in South Texas. Ditto Puerto Rican Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Dominican Americans, and so on. Grouping all these folks together under an arbitrary pan-ethnic banner of Hispanic or Latino is a white invention. So let's keep that in mind as we try to figure out how they voted this year. Okay, the Hispanic vote in the just completed election is a developing story in the sense that we still don't have certified vote totals in all 50 states, even as we tape this conversation on November 20th, which is 17 days after the election. Although more data is dribbling in each day, and I've been monitoring it, and I'm actually using some of it if it comes from a reliable source like the New York Times, we really can't crunch the granular 2020 numbers yet. We do have some exit poll data, but chances are it's just as unreliable as the pre-election horse race polling that so badly undercounted Trump's vote share. So I'm not going to rely on that. I'm also deeply suspicious of every pundit's hot take about this year's voting before the dust settles.
Right.
So instead, I'm going to talk about the trends in Hispanic vote share over the past couple of decades, and then point to a few things we might be seeing from the 2020 election. The data I'm drawing on primarily come from the years 2000 to 2018, 2018 being the most recent national election for which we have complete numbers. So, with that as the preface, here's the big picture about voting trends in America. Over the past few decades, data from the Pew Research Center shows the Republican Party maintaining an advantage among white voters. It was about 11 points in 2018, and it's probably going to be larger this year, while Democrats have a big edge among Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters. Black voters are the most reliable supporters of Democrats, favoring them by overwhelming margins like 70 to 75 points. And that's a number that has held steady since at least the mid-1990s. Asian support has been growing in recent years and sat around 55 points in 2018, though Trump might have eroded that margin some this year. Baseline Hispanic support of Democrats has been holding steady in the range of 30 points. And I mean a 30-point margin, so 65 to 35 typically. Even though Hispanic voters have strongly supported Democrats, their margin of support is not as overwhelming as it is with Blacks or Asians. Meanwhile, the non-Hispanic white share of the electorate has been in steady decline. Nationally, whites made up 76% of eligible voters in 2000, but that share fell to 67% in 2018. So basically down from 3/4 to 2/3. And that's in less than a generation. This decline of white vote share is happening in all 50 states, though the rate of decline varies from state to state. California is one of 3 states in the nation that now has a majority-minority population. Its white voter share dwindling from 60% in 2000 to 45% in 2018.
Wow.
And now just a quickie quiz, Mark. Do you know the other 2 majority-minority states in the U.S.?
Oh, I'm going to guess they'd have to be in the South because they would include large numbers of migrants across the border. It's tricky, though, because so many of the southern states vote reliably Republican, and that goes against my preconceptions.
So take a guess.
Let's say Virginia is one, and Georgia is the second.
Wrong on both. Hawaii is one, and now you're probably kicking yourself.
Damn
right?
it. Damn it. I was thinking contiguous states. Okay. Yeah.
Right. The other one is New Mexico. And it's no surprise that all 3 of those states, California, New Mexico, Hawaii, they're all bright blue when it comes to presidential elections.
In my defense, I forgot that New Mexico existed. So
oh my God.
That's the best I can do on that one.
You just alienated thousands of our listeners in New Mexico. So
I know.
Good job.
I know. I'm gonna have to go on an apology tour through the cities of New Mexico to get mansplaining back on their podcast listing list.
Right. So Texas had a bare majority of 51% white voters in 2018. So it'll probably become the 4th majority-minority state this year or very soon. And it's no coincidence that it's slowly becoming a battleground state as well, for exactly that reason. According to Pew, there are nearly 61 million Hispanics in the USA. They comprise more than 18% of the population and about 13% of the electorate. The Hispanic share of the electorate is growing fast, increasing from 7% in 2000 to 13% in 2018. So that's nearly doubling in less than a generation.
Wow.
Just to put this in perspective, in that same time frame, the Asian share of the electorate also doubled, but from 2% to 4%. And the black share held relatively steady from 12% to 13%. Mm-hmm. Minority voters together were responsible for 76% of the growth in the United States' eligible voter population between 2000 and 2018. So Hispanics alone accounted for more than half of that growth, that 76% growth in voter population. And this year, Hispanics surpassed blacks as the largest minority group among eligible voters. This national trend of Hispanic growth is especially pronounced in large southwestern states like California and Texas, but it's also happening in battleground states like Arizona, Florida, and even Pennsylvania. In Florida, 20% of eligible voters in 2018 were Hispanic, which was nearly double that of 2000, while the white vote share dropped 13 points. In Arizona, Hispanic voters comprised 24% of the electorate in 2018, an increase of 8 points from 2000, while white voter share dropped by 12 points. And even in Pennsylvania, the white share dropped 7 points while the Hispanic share rose 3 points, which is not as significant as Florida or Arizona, but in a state that was so closely contested and so pivotal to the result of the last 2 elections, every single point matters.
Right.
It's true that whites are still more likely to be registered to vote and more likely to turn out to the polls than are Hispanic and other minority voters. But as Stacey Abrams just proved in Georgia, the changing face of the electorate can indeed swing elections. Black voter share spiked in metro Atlanta. White voter share statewide was down to just 58% in 2018 and likely even lower this year. And voila, Georgia went blue. And between you and me, let's pray it stays blue in the 2 Senate runoffs coming up in January 5th.
Yeah, fingers crossed. It'll be tough, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, it certainly helps that Georgia went blue last month. It gives people some confidence that they can do this again in January. And now I want to pivot to the Hispanic vote in the 2020 election. One of the major headlines coming out of this election is that Trump picked up a lot more Latino and Black voters nationwide. And that time I used the term Latino purposely because Trump's gains came primarily from men. Trump is certainly not the first Republican president to enjoy support among the Hispanic electorate. 37% of Hispanics voted for Ronald Reagan's re-election in 1984. While 40% supported George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. Trump's share appears to have gone from 28% in 2016 to about 32% this year. That's a modest improvement, but it led to clear wins in high-profile states like Florida and Texas and very closely contested elections in several other battleground states. And it happened despite Trump's documented antipathy to both illegal and legal immigration. Many Democrats are wondering, how the heck did he get more Hispanic voters this time? As the data gets crunched, I suspect there will be many plausible answers to that question, but I'd like to offer 3. First, as you and I discussed in our episode about the Electoral College, the presidential election is not one national election, but 50 state elections. When we take this national trend of growing Hispanic vote share down to the state level, the relative vote share of particular Hispanic constituencies in particular states makes all the difference. So my answer number 1 is ethnicity matters. Take Florida, for instance. Unlike many other states, Florida's votes have been known since election night, so we can talk about them with some confidence. In Florida, Cuban Americans, concentrated mostly in Miami-Dade County, have long been the largest chunk of the Hispanic electorate. There are 2 million Hispanics living in Miami-Dade alone. Over the past decade, Puerto Ricans were the fastest growing Hispanic subgroup in Florida, and their overall numbers in the state now rival that of Cubans. This year, Democrats were basically hoping that the blue-leaning Puerto Rican vote would cancel out the red-leaning Cuban vote. But instead, what happened was the Cuban vote swung even more heavily to Trump than it did in 2016. Some exit polls reported that 52% of Cuban Americans in Florida voted for Trump. Trump didn't win Miami-Dade, but he lost it by only 7 points after losing it by 29 points to Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
Trump's relative success in Miami-Dade was integral to his statewide victory in that it denied Joe Biden the huge margin in South Florida that he needed to withstand Republican strength in the many rural white communities in places like the Panhandle. The same underwhelming Hispanic support that doomed Biden also took down 2 incumbent Democratic congresswomen in the Miami metro area, Donna Shalala and Debbie Mukersel Powell. Now, what sealed the fate of all 3 of them was the Trump campaign's success in stoking fear of creeping socialism among Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, Colombian, and especially Cuban American voters, many of whom came to the USA to escape socialist or communist authoritarian dictatorships in those countries.
Yeah, the specter of Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez and Daniel Ortega was probably hanging right over that election.
Yes, absolutely. No doubt about it. It's hard for you or me to conceive of sleepy Joe Biden or the former HHS Secretary Shalala as radical socialists, but Trump's invoking of that bogeyman reminded these voters of the dysfunctional governments that they or their parents or grandparents left behind. It wasn't just Florida where Trump made gains, though. Another example that has received a lot of attention since the election is Zapata County, which is a small border county in southwest Texas. Zapata flipped from blue to red this year and voted for a Republican for the first time in 100 years.
Wow.
Now, Zapata County is 94% Mexican American, and it's a place with virtually no organized Republican Party. And yet it was one of several border counties along the Rio Grande Valley that got much redder this year. Republican vote share in these counties increased from 29.6% in 2012, 8 years ago, to just under 42% in 2020. Why such a big swing to Trump?
I know. And I'm thinking as you described this, that if it had gone the other way, Rudy Giuliani would be holding press conferences in front of landscaping companies insisting that that can only be the product of fraud.
Yeah. Well, why don't you take a guess before I tell you why Zapata County vote flips so heavily to Trump? Want to take a guess at that?
My only guess is that it was a religious affiliation with the Catholic Church and anti-abortion vote. And that's really all I've got.
Yeah, that's an excellent guess, and that did actually play a factor, and I'll mention that briefly in a minute. But here's the reason about Zapata County. Most of the residents of that county and the Rio Grande Valley in general work in the natural gas industry. And they were spooked by Biden's comments about phasing out oil and gas production to move to greener energy sources.
Right.
According to a local official, Zapata residents are strongly opposed to Trump's border wall, but the feared loss of their jobs was even more important to them.
Yeah.
Which is to say that in some places, it's still the economy, stupid.
Oh, it's always the economy, stupid. Yeah. Yeah, Biden had a reputation as a politician who would put his foot in his mouth. And as I recall, he did it really only twice during this election. I think possibly one of the great benefits of the pandemic to his campaign is it just kept him away from microphones. So fewer opportunities. But one of the screw-ups was that unguarded comment about doing away with the gas industry.
I think somebody famously defined a political gaffe as when you inadvertently tell the truth and then have to apologize for it. So the irony of this, of course, is that the oil and gas industry is going to go away and must go away if we're to avert climate catastrophe.
But you don't talk about that in Texas for the same reason that you don't talk about the need to do away with coal mining in West Virginia.
Exactly. And so basically that's my second answer of the three I'm offering today. Issues matter. A political issue like socialism has outsized importance in South Florida, while in South Texas, a pocketbook issue like the fate of the local oil and gas economy was paramount. Many white Democrats probably assume that the generic Hispanic voter cares more about immigration than any other single issue, but that's just not true. A national survey of the Hispanic electorate published by Unidos US and Latino Decisions in the summer of 2019 found that jobs in the economy and healthcare ranked higher than immigration for the voters surveyed. And guess what? Those are the same two issues that rank 1, 2 all year in surveys of all voters.
Right.
And those are not the only issues that may have moved Hispanics to Trump. As you yourself just pointed out, many Hispanics are devout Catholics or evangelical Christians for whom the culture of life is the major issue. For socially conservative voters like that, Trump's 3 Supreme Court picks, his adamant opposition to abortion, and basically his court packing were probably determinative.
Yeah. My mother-in-law is Colombian and an ardent Catholic. Going to church, hugely important to her. And periodically over the years that I have known her, I've heard stories of the priest within her church directly campaigning for Republican candidates in Chicago or on the national level. And it was exactly on that point, that the church is against abortion, this politician is against abortion, any politician who's not against abortion is against God. Therefore, you need to vote Republican. And this would have been within what would otherwise be a very deep blue, very Democratic district, and the church was trying to siphon off a few votes.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that that single issue siphoned off some votes. And remember, Trump's play here is just to diminish the overwhelming margins that Hispanics vote for Biden or Hillary, not to erase them altogether, to just cut away at them. That could be the difference between winning and losing particular states. There's a third answer I want to give today to why Trump got a larger share of the Hispanic vote. And it's not about Hispanic voters per se. It's this: class matters. There's a sorting by socioeconomic class that's been happening in the American electorate over the past few election cycles that arguably now plays an even larger role in voting behavior than ethnicity, policy issues, or anything else. One of the most reliable indicators of partisan affiliation nowadays is whether or not you have a college degree. If you do, then you're likely to have voted for Biden. If you don't, then you're likely to have voted for Trump. Mm-hmm. This trend appears to be cutting across ethnicity, or at least it's cutting across ethnicity more than it has in the past. And that might explain why Trump was able to increase the ranks of his white working class coalition from 2016 by adding Hispanic voters without college degrees, not only in the oil fields of South Texas, where most Hispanics work in blue-collar jobs, but also in high turnout cities with large Hispanic populations like Phoenix, Arizona. In fact, in 45 majority Hispanic counties, Biden's vote grew by 17% over that of Hillary, which sounds great, but Trump's vote grew by 37%.
Wow.
Looking ahead to 2024 and beyond, the scary thing for Democrats, I think at least, is whether a charismatic Republican without Trump's baggage can consolidate all that working class support by adding even more people of color.
The part of this that boggles my mind is that so much of Trump's appeal to his white working class base is at the very least a racist dog whistle and at worst open racism. And that the object of that racism would find some element of that appeal equally appealing. Like, I am really struggling to reconcile that.
Yeah, I do have a guess about this, and it has to do with the so-called low information voter. We know all those jokes from all the way back to childhood that half the U.S. population can't even identify the vice president, even if shown a picture, right? So there are many, many low information voters, and surely that includes Hispanic people. And maybe the more nuanced way to refer to it is that they have information about the issues that matter to them, right? So if you're a oil and gas worker in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, you care about whether your job is going to exist next year. So you're a high information voter when it comes to the local economy, but you might be a low information voter about other things, including, border wall that doesn't affect anybody in your family and kids being put in cages that has nothing to do with anyone in your circle,
Yeah. Yeah, you make me think there of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are you familiar with that?
I am not, no.
There's a hierarchy of needs that I remember first hearing about when I was in grad school. And it's basically that any human being needs to satisfy certain needs by order of precedence. So, for instance, if you're being chased by a lion, your immediate need is safety. Other immediate needs are food, health, shelter. And any human being is going to be focused on satisfying those needs before they satisfy higher needs, which are things like love or acceptance of the community or spiritual aspirations. So you can say that in order to be happy, you need to have some higher level spiritual component there, but you're not going to worry about that if you're struggling to feed yourself on a day-to-day basis. And so maybe if we look at that through this lens, we can understand how someone who's worried about keeping his house, because if he loses his job, then he's not going to be able to make payments on his mortgage, is going to be much more focused on a just bottom line economic appeal, even if it comes from a candidate whose values are very different from his, because values are a higher level of need, which he is not so focused on sustaining.
Right, especially if that candidate is saturation bombing that person with ad after ad after ad talking about how Biden's going to destroy the oil economy, your job's going to go away.
But it does provide a solution for Democrats, at least within their messaging, is that they don't need to offset a fear and anger-based appeal with equivalent fear or anger, or to try to shame people into voting because racism is beneath us.
Right.
They would just need to focus on whatever the hierarchy of needs is. And if you're speaking to a community where they're worried that maybe they can't support their children, just focus on making them feel safe in that regard, and then they'll feel prepared to vote their conscience on other issues.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I don't want to leave you with the impression, despite all this talk of how Trump whittled away Biden's vote share of Hispanics, I don't want to leave the impression that the vast majority of Hispanics nationwide did not turn out for Joe Biden, because they did. When all the votes are counted nationally, Biden will probably end up with nearly 7 out of every 10 Hispanic votes. He will likely receive 3/4 of the vote from voters under 30 and from Hispanic women overall. He'll do less well among voters of Central and South American ancestry, but will still receive about 60% of their votes. Only the staunchly conservative Cuban American community will have given Trump an outright majority of their votes.
Okay.
Also, Trump's gains among Hispanics in Miami-Dade, Zapata, and elsewhere don't mean that immigration was not a major issue this year. It most certainly was. Biden's share of the Mexican-American vote will probably be close to 75%. They came out in record numbers to oppose Trump's border wall, his child separation policies, his anti-immigrant rhetoric, and the overwhelming margins they provided made the difference in keeping Nevada blue and in flipping Arizona for the first time since 1992, as did the votes of other Hispanic populations in states with razor-thin margins like Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's got 500,000 Hispanic voters, so that's a very influential bloc, especially in a close election.
Yeah.
So I think the real lesson here is that Hispanic Americans are just as diverse, just as complicated as the rest of us.
Yeah.
My glass half full take is that Hispanics don't vote in lockstep and are just as likely to care about the vast number of pressing issues facing America right now as you and I. The glass half empty version is that they're just as likely as whites are to be bamboozled by baseless claims of socialism run amok, and Latino and black men in particular are just as vulnerable to Trump's phony image of hyper-masculinity as all those fat white guys with long guns wearing MAGA hats.
Yeah.
If there's a hero in this year's election story, I think it's the American women of all races and ethnicities who saved our country by not falling for Trump's con. The exit polls say that men preferred Trump by 8 points, while women preferred Biden by 15. Thank God for those women. They are truly our better half.
Yeah. Oh, I thank God for women every single day. I think it's always worth pointing out that no one is a single issue voter, by and large. Maybe there are a few out there, but anytime we are particularly looking at a group that's different from ourselves, so we as white males thinking about the African-American vote or the Hispanic vote or whatever, and thinking that's going to pivot on a single point, we are inevitably going to be wrong. Like I remember when Michael Dukakis was running against George Bush Sr., and when he accepted the Democratic nomination, part of his speech was in Spanish. And I remember that just electrified the white supporters, like, oh my gosh, what a powerful appeal to the Hispanic vote. Maybe we'll flip Texas. And of course, he did not carry Texas. He got murdered in that election because that was a very simplistic understanding of a very diverse population, that simply his ability to speak in Spanish represented an emotional appeal that would pull them away from supporting another candidate or get them out to the polls. It's never that simple.
Right. And I think as the election results become more solidified and people have time to reflect on them, I think we're going to see a spate of articles in the press about how Democrats made the terrible mistake of assuming all Hispanics have the same interest And, the number one concern is immigration. They're so outraged by what's going on the southern border that no other issue can permeate their view, and therefore they're going to go out and vote in huge numbers for Democrats everywhere in the country. And that's clearly not true.
No.
And that's going to be the thing that they study up on for the next election, in my opinion.
I think that they should be out looking for the Stacey Abrams of the Latino or Hispanic communities, because she understood how to get African Americans in Georgia, specifically Atlanta, out to the polls who otherwise would not have voted.
Yeah.
And she was so instrumental in flipping that state blue in this election. I think if I were in charge of the Democratic Party, I would be out beating the bush, finding who it is on the local level who understands local Hispanic Latino voters, what is important to them, how to get them excited about voting, how to get them to register, and listen to them instead of just assuming that that vote is going to show up. Don't take anyone for granted. Work and understand how to turn out that vote.
Right. Yeah, no doubt about it. So I believe I've now answered the first part of your question, is there such a thing as the Hispanic vote? But I want us to just spend a minute talking about the second part of your question, which is who is it likely to benefit in 2024? The easy cop-out answer is whoever has the D after their name. But I think the more accurate answer is who the hell knows? If the right Republican candidate emerges, he or she, and knowing Republicans, probably he, can get Reagan or Bush-like numbers or even better. Anyone who tells you that the votes of tens of millions of Americans of dozens of ethnicities living in every state in the Union are going to break predictably one way or the other, instead of the many different and nuanced ways they broke on November 3rd, is full of crap. So I think you anticipated the answer to the first question, that the Hispanic vote is not a monolith, right, Mark?
Yeah, I pretty much knew what the answer was because I have had a Colombian wife for pushing 20 years at this point. And so just by association with my in-laws, I knew that Colombian is different from Mexican, which is different from Nicaraguan, which is different from Cuban, which is different from Guatemalan, that all of those communities have a distinct viewpoint and different set of values, different level of identification with Catholicism. And so it was very much a misnomer. When I was in religious studies, the professors like to tell us that Hinduism doesn't exist. It's just a word that we apply to about 2,000 different local religions. And I've come to believe that Hispanic is kind of the same. It's just an umbrella term that obscures more than it reveals.
Right. Yeah. Originally adopted for the census as a descriptive term and now is used kind of as a cultural term. And it's just not up to the task as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah. I'm curious to see how much Catholic identity remains a significant force within the Hispanic Latino community. Because anecdotally, the people I've known, second-generation Latin Americans, Hispanic Americans, are significantly less religious than their parents were. And so I wonder if time in country and number of generations in country is going to make that less of a factor on hot-button issues like abortion.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's data to support your idea already, and we'll see what happens. Young people are very, very liberal, whether they're Hispanic or Asian or black or white. Dropping old religious customs is part of becoming more secular and liberal. So,
yep, I guess we'll see.
And we'll also see about that ethnosexual vote. I suspect it's going to be a swing constituency in 2024.
Right. And there's no constituency that swings like those ethnosexuals. So on that note, have you got a question for me for next time?
I do, yeah. Ever since the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis cop, a new phrase has entered the American lexicon: defund the police. By social and criminal justice advocates to point a way out of the bleak status quo of over-incarceration and police brutality that blacks live in now. The phrase has also been used by so-called law and order advocates to stoke fears of crime and rioting in the streets. From the beginning, it seemed to me like a very poorly worded expression that was bound to further polarize our country. Mm-hmm. So, Mark, I'd like you to tell me where this expression came from, whether the people who use it actually support the literal defunding of police departments. And just as importantly, I want to know what you think a careful redirection of police resources might look like.
Okay, that's the meaty one. I look forward to wading into that.
Great.
Okay, that's what we've got for this week. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to listen to us, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.